At 3:17 a.m. in Terminal 4 baggage claim, security cameras captured a lone baggage handler approaching an oversized armored cash container destined for Banco Nacional in São Paulo. The reinforced metal crate sat on the conveyor belt among regular luggage, its exterior marked with standard cargo codes that revealed nothing about the $13 million in unmarked bills contained within. The handler moved with practiced efficiency, unlocking the container with what appeared to be a standard key while other airport workers continued their overnight shifts nearby. Within 4 minutes, every stack of cash had vanished from the container, which was then resealed and sent on its way to the aircraft cargo hold. He wore a neon safety vest and regulation smile badge like every other employee on the overnight shift. But beneath that routine appearance was a plan that no one saw coming. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. 10 days before he vanished into the night, Luis Mendoza was working his regular shift in the cargo hold at Skyport International Airport. The 38-year-old baggage handler moved pallets of luggage with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same task for 8 years. At midnight, the airport transformed into a different world, where skeleton crews processed international cargo and prepared aircraft for early morning departures. Luis had volunteered for the overnight shift because it paid a premium rate, and he needed every dollar he could earn to support his daughter's college education. He knew exactly which shipment would carry more than just suitcases that night, because he had spent weeks learning the patterns of special cargo flights from Latin America. Luis Mendoza had built his life around responsibility and sacrifice. As a single father raising his daughter Maria after her mother died in a car accident, he had structured every decision around providing her with opportunities he never had. Luis was an ex-Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to civilian life with few marketable skills beyond discipline and reliability. The baggage handler job at Skyport International Airport offered steady employment with benefits, and Luis had maintained a perfect attendance record for 8 years. He worked overtime whenever possible, picking up extra shifts during holidays and peak travel seasons. Despite his efforts, his income was barely sufficient to cover basic expenses, let alone the rapidly increasing costs of higher education. Luis had calculated every expense related to Maria's college plans with military precision. Her academic performance had earned her a partial scholarship to study engineering at the state university, but the scholarship covered only 60% of her tuition and fees. The remaining $40,000 represented an impossible financial burden for a man earning $32,000 annually as a baggage handler. Luis had applied for every available loan program, but his credit score and income level limited his options. He faced the devastating reality that his daughter might have to abandon her educational dreams because he could not provide the financial support she needed. The triggering event occurred on a Tuesday morning when Maria received notification that her scholarship had been revoked due to budget cuts in the university's financial aid program. The letter arrived in their mailbox like a death sentence for her academic future. Luis watched his daughter cry as she read the formal language explaining that funding was no longer available for her major. The gap between her dreams and their financial reality had suddenly expanded to $50,000. An amount that represented more than Luis earned in an entire year. That same week, Luis learned through conversations with other airport workers about the weekly cash flights from Latin America that carried what everyone understood to be cartel-related bribes and money laundering operations. Luis rationalized his decision with the cold logic of a military strategist analyzing an impossible situation. These were not legitimate business transactions being conducted by honest people. The cash shipments represented criminal proceeds that would be used to corrupt officials and facilitate drug trafficking operations. Luis told himself that he was simply redirecting criminal funds toward a moral purpose, specifically his daughter's education. More importantly, he was uniquely positioned to access these shipments because of his security clearance and detailed knowledge of cargo handling procedures. Luis had spent 8 years building trust with supervisors and establishing himself as a reliable employee who never asked questions about unusual cargo or special handling requirements. Luis began his reconnaissance by studying the protocols for handling special cash shipments from high-risk international destinations. These armored containers were loaded at the cargo apron under the supervision of 2 outside security contractors who worked for a company that specialized in transporting high-value assets. The containers passed through what airport personnel called the sterile zone, an area where cargo was considered secure and exempt from routine customs inspections. Luis learned that the containers were designed to prevent tampering during transport, but they relied on standard padlocks that could be duplicated by someone with access to the original keys. Luis observed the security contractors during multiple shifts, noting their routines and identifying potential vulnerabilities in their procedures. The guards followed a predictable pattern of checks and handoffs, and Luis discovered that there were brief windows when the containers were unattended during shift changes. He also studied the CCTV system and learned that certain angles provided blind spots where activities could occur without being recorded. Luis realized that the airport's security system was designed to prevent external threats rather than insider theft, creating opportunities for someone with legitimate access to bypass multiple layers of protection. Luis acquired the tools necessary for his plan through careful preparation over several weeks. He obtained duplicate keys for the armored containers by volunteering to assist with cargo inspections, during which he was able to make impressions of the original keys without arousing suspicion. Luis had the duplicate keys manufactured by a locksmith who believed they were needed for legitimate security testing. He also modified one of the standard padlocks used on the containers, creating a version that appeared locked but could be opened without a key. Luis tested this modified lock extensively to ensure it would function properly under the stress of the actual operation. Luis cultivated a relationship with Roberto, a runway maintenance crew member who had access to the airport's technical systems. Roberto was dissatisfied with his low wages and lack of advancement opportunities, making him receptive to Luis's suggestion that they could both benefit from a temporary disruption of the CCTV system during routine maintenance. Luis convinced Roberto that the disruption was necessary to test backup security procedures, and Roberto agreed to help without understanding the true purpose of the request. Luis never revealed his actual plan to Roberto, maintaining operational security while gaining access to the technical capabilities he needed. Luis prepared contingency plans for every scenario he could anticipate. If the CCTV system was restored earlier than expected, he would trigger a false mechanical failure alarm that would divert security attention away from the cargo area. If additional security personnel were present during the critical window, Luis would postpone the operation until conditions were more favorable. He identified a service tunnel under the apron that could serve as a temporary hiding place for the stolen cash, and he prepared false documentation that would explain his presence in restricted areas if questioned by security personnel. The execution of Luis's plan began at 3 a.m. when the armored container arrived from Bogota on a regularly scheduled cargo flight. Luis positioned himself near the container as it was transferred from the aircraft to the baggage handling system. He had volunteered for the overnight shift specifically to ensure he would be working during the critical time window. Luis approached the security contractor responsible for the container and engaged in casual conversation while they waited for the transfer to be completed. During their interaction, Luis managed to obtain the container's key through a handshake maneuver he had practiced extensively. At 3:10 a.m., Luis waited for the security contractor to move away from the container before implementing his plan. He used the obtained key to unlock the container, revealing $13 million in cash bundled in standard currency wrappings. Luis had prepared empty packages of identical size and weight to replace the cash bundles, ensuring that the container would not feel significantly different when handled. He transferred the cash to a modified luggage cart that appeared to contain routine baggage, then replaced each bundle with a replica package. Luis relocked the container with his modified padlock, which appeared secure but could be opened easily when he needed to access it again. Luis signaled to Roberto to reboot the CCTV system according to their agreed-upon plan. Roberto believed he was conducting routine maintenance testing and had no knowledge of the theft occurring simultaneously. The timing of the system reboot provided Luis with additional cover as he completed the transfer of cash from the container to his luggage cart. Luis had practiced these movements extensively and was able to complete the entire operation in under 4 minutes, well within the window he had calculated would be necessary to avoid detection. At 3:15 a.m., Luis transported the container to the aircraft cargo hold according to standard procedures. He greeted other crew members normally and showed no signs of stress or unusual behavior. The $13 million in cash was concealed within his modified luggage cart, distributed among several compartments to avoid obvious weight concentration. Luis completed his shift and left the airport at his normal time, maintaining his routine to avoid arousing suspicion. He had successfully stolen $13 million without anyone realizing that a theft had occurred. The armored container passed through customs X-ray inspection at 4:30 a.m. without incident. The empty replica packages appeared identical to cash bundles on the screening equipment, and customs officers had no reason to suspect that the container had been tampered with. The X-ray technology was designed to detect weapons and contraband rather than verify the contents of currency shipments, creating a blind spot that Luis had anticipated. The container was loaded onto the Brazilian flight along with other cargo, and customs officers recorded no anomalies in their inspection logs. The Brazilian flight departed on schedule at 5 a.m., carrying the empty container toward its destination in São Paulo. Luis had calculated that the theft would not be discovered until the container reached Banco Nacional, providing him with several hours to implement the next phase of his plan. He left the airport at the end of his shift and drove to a predetermined location where he had prepared additional resources for laundering the stolen cash. Luis understood that possessing $13 million in cash would be meaningless unless he could convert it into assets that could be used safely. The theft was discovered at 6 a.m. when bank officials in São Paulo opened the container and found empty replica packages instead of the expected cash bundles. The bank immediately contacted the shipping company, which launched an investigation into the security breach. Airport police were notified and began securing the cargo area where the theft had occurred. However, the investigation was hampered by the gap in CCTV coverage that had occurred during the system reboot, and investigators had no clear evidence of who had accessed the container or when the theft had taken place. Luis had hidden the stolen cash in a service tunnel beneath the airport runway, an area that was accessible to maintenance personnel but rarely inspected by security. He waited 2 nights before retrieving the money, using his knowledge of airport security patterns to avoid detection. Luis had prepared the hiding place weeks in advance, ensuring that the cash would remain secure until he could safely transport it to the next phase of his operation. The service tunnel provided perfect concealment because it was considered part of the airport's infrastructure rather than a potential crime scene. Luis implemented his money laundering strategy through a contact he had developed in the airport's cargo shipping community. This contact specialized in converting large amounts of cash into portable high-value assets, particularly diamonds and precious metals that could be easily transported across international borders. Luis had identified this contact through months of careful observation and relationship building, presenting himself as someone who needed to move legitimate assets for tax purposes. The contact had no knowledge of the theft and believed he was providing a routine service for someone with legal financial resources. The conversion process required several weeks of careful transactions to avoid attracting attention from financial monitoring systems. Luis converted the cash into diamonds through a series of purchases conducted through intermediaries who maintained distance from the actual exchanges. He then arranged for the diamonds to be transported through legitimate freight shipments, using his knowledge of cargo handling procedures to ensure the assets reached their destination safely. Luis had studied international shipping regulations and customs procedures to identify the most secure methods for moving high-value items across borders. Luis used a portion of the converted assets to obtain false identification documents and travel papers that would allow him to leave the United States without detection. He had researched the requirements for establishing a new identity in Mexico and had prepared the necessary supporting documentation over several months. Luis arranged for a legitimate business cover story, establishing a small logistics firm in Guadalajara that would explain his presence in the country and provide a source of apparent income. The business was registered under his assumed name and appeared to be a legitimate import-export operation. Luis's departure from the United States was carefully planned to avoid suspicion. He maintained his normal routine at work and home until the day before his planned departure, then called in sick and simply disappeared. Luis had prepared explanations for his absence that would delay any investigation into his whereabouts. He used his false identification to board a commercial flight to Mexico City, then traveled overland to Guadalajara, where he established his new life. Luis had calculated that the investigation would focus on airport personnel, but his perfect employment record and lack of obvious motive would make him a low-priority suspect. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.